Hi, I'm trying to give you a little intro to the Aeneid, or the excerpt from the Aeneid that I put in your course book. There are a few things to know about this. The thing it might remind you of the most is the Odyssey, and that's not a coincidence. The Aeneid is a Roman trying to do what the Greeks did, and the Romans were always trying to do that when it came to the arts and culture. They admired the Greeks. They looked up to the Greeks. They wanted to think of themselves as the natural inheritors of Greek tradition. And they were also always kind of intimidated by the Greeks because there was always a sense that, oh man, I can't do it as well as they did. Holy cannoli. The guy who wrote the Aeneid, Virgil, was writing about 800 years later, probably. No one knows exactly when Homer wrote the Iliad or the Odyssey. But Virgil was probably writing about 800 years later, and for him, Homer was the gold standard. It's the way a modern American writer might feel about Shakespeare. And he once said that trying to lift a verse from Homer is like trying to lift the club of Hercules. He was very conscious that he was following in the footsteps of a giant. A lot of artists do that, by the way. There's always this sense for young artists, like, how can I possibly compete with the guys who already did this? I mean, what can I have that's new to say that they haven't already done? So I want to write a play, but Shakespeare's already lived, Ibsen has already lived, George Bernard Shaw, these great Sophocles. It's all been done. Artists are always struggling with that. That's a critic once called it the anxiety of influence. That you fall in love with a certain kind of art, and then you want to do your own, but it's like you can't just rehash what those guys did. Why would anyone want to look at yours when they've got theirs to look at? So Virgil had plenty of the anxiety of influence when he would set out to write an epic poem. So why do it in the first place? I think it was the Romans wanted to celebrate their own glory in a certain sort of way. Virgil wrote at the time of the Emperor Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor and probably the best Roman emperor. And he knew Augustus, and Augustus was his patron and gave him a lot of money for writing things that would glorify the Roman Empire, which was a new thing. To even call it the empire. Rome is a very powerful state that dominated other people was not new, but calling it an empire was. So in some sense, Virgil was trying to further the glory of Rome. And one of the ways in which he wanted to do it was that the Romans were going to claim ancestry from a Trojan hero, Aeneas. You remember Odysseus was trying to come back from the Trojan War, and that's what got him so delayed. And the Trojan War was the great subject of both the Iliad and the Odyssey in some sense. The Iliad during the war, the Odyssey after the war. Well, the Romans picked up on the Trojans also in those books come across as pretty admirable and pretty heroic, and they were deeply respected by the Greeks, who were writing about the story. So what Rome did, although it considered its own founder to be Romulus, one of the two twins, Romulus and Remus, it thought that the people from whom Romulus was born had come to Italy from Troy originally. That Aeneas, who was one of the princes of the house of Priam was the king of Troy, and who was the son of the goddess Venus, who the Greeks called Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Aeneas had escaped from the destruction of Troy with a few people, with a little band of followers, including his father and his wife and stuff happens with his wife. Never mind about that. You'll read about that. But Aeneas had escaped with a small band and sailed around looking for a place to found a new city, and that the gods were determined that he would found Rome, or that at least his descendants would found Rome. So the story of the Aeneid is of Aeneas' journey after the fall of Troy. And the selection you read is where he's come to North Africa, to the city of Carthage. I tell you a little bit about the intro in there, but I'll just sort of Carthage. It's very significant that he meets Queen Dido of Carthage, because Carthage was Rome's great rival. By the time of Augustus, Carthage had been destroyed, but for a long time they fought several wars against the Carthaginians. They were known as the Punic Wars, because Punic was the language spoken by Carthaginians. Carthage was in a very strategic spot in North Africa, where the Mediterranean Sea is very narrow, and so they had a kind of it was natural for them to become a great naval power, and they had a great navy, and they were very good merchants and traders, so they made a lot of money that way. They didn't have great soil. North African soil has never been great, but they became a natural rival to Rome. However, at the time of Aeneas, Carthage had just been founded by a queen who was basically running away from treacherous relatives, and Queen Dido was kind to Aeneas and his group, and it says a little bit about in the little intro that I wrote for you in the book too, about what happens with with Aeneas and Dido. That became the story, a doomed love story, basically between Aeneas and Dido. Was it has been, they've made plays about it and operas about it and all kinds of stuff. But the part of the Aeneid that I gave you was Aeneas talking about the fall of Troy, about what happened, why Troy fell, and how he escaped from it. Okay, the propaganda purposes, include that if Rome could trace its ancestry back to the Trojans and to this noble Trojan hero, pious Aeneas, who always gave his due to the gods, who always did his duty to his family, to his people, to his gods, then that was a sort of glorious ancestry for Rome to have. So that's kind of the setup about why Virgil wrote this poem in the first place. It really was kind of the summit of Roman literary art. I think nobody who's read any Roman literature would disagree with that the Aeneid was the best they did. And that doesn't mean it was as good as the Greeks. Well, some people like the Aeneid as well as Homer, and some people don't. But Rome, as I say, most of the artistic productions it did were sort of copying the Greeks, and people don't read the Romans as eagerly as they still read the Greeks. However, people study their history because what Rome did in the world was incredible. Roman history is endlessly fascinating. Roman writing is not endlessly fascinating, but I think the Aeneid is kind of, most people would say that's a pretty routine thing to think, that the Aeneid was the best they did. A couple other things worth knowing about the Aeneid. The first half of it is sometimes called the Odysseic Aeneid because it kind of resembles the Odyssey. It's about Aeneas wandering and journeying and trying to get to a new home. And so it has a lot in common with the Odyssey. The second half of the Aeneid, and these things are divided almost exactly in half, is called the Iliadic Aeneid because it resembles the Iliad. It's a story of battles. Aeneas and his followers have gotten to Italy and they need to fight for their lives, and they've got significant enemies who are no pushovers at all. And there's a guy named Turnus who is sometimes referred to as a new Achilles. That's how mighty he is. And so the second half of the Aeneid is about a war, and which is what the Iliad was about. So there's this interesting thing that Virgil seems to have copied one book of, or not copied, that's not fair, to have emulated one book of Homer's for the first half and another book for the second half. It's worth trying to get a sense of the sort of man that Aeneas is as you read this. And it's also worth trying to get a sense of the relationship of him to the gods, and if him to fate. This was a man whose nation was destroyed, who most of the people he loved were killed, who had to watch his city burn, and then had to go and be a refugee and try and make a new life. That's the through line of the Aeneid. And he bears up under tremendous loss And that's, I think, what you want to look for is you look for the emotional center of this selection. Take care.